Hello, my wonderful, beautiful friends, guys. Welcome back to our /Entitled People, where people truly believe that the world revolves around them and nobody matters. And in today's episode, it's all about entitled people when it comes to relationships, guys. We've got Karens trying to steal husbands from people, throwing tantrums when told no. Opie tells a story about the time she was almost married off to some random guy, and one Karen learns a lesson that she'll never forget after she messes with an off-duty cop. Guys, you'll be shaking your heads so hard in this one. I hope you enjoy the stories. Hit subscribe if you're not subscribed, and as always, you can send or link your post to this email right here. Let's dive in. So this happened over 10 years ago. My girlfriend at the time is now my wife. We're happily married. With that said, here's the story. When my wife and I were about half a year in the relationship, she was approached by a guy she kind of knew, who we'll call Jacob. Jacob and my wife shared a mutual friend, and at the time, Jacob had a crush on my wife. One day, he shows up at my wife's workplace during her shift. She was working KFC at the time. He then demanded that she break up with me and start dating him, because according to him, I had had her for long enough, and she should give him a chance to see where things would go. Unsurprisingly, my wife was totally creeped out, and she told him to F off. I was also pretty bothered about the whole situation, but not in a position to confront Jacob about it, as I was hoping that was the only time he would do something like this. Now, unbeknownst to Jacob, the mutual friend was also a friend of mine, so I asked him about the whole situation. Mutual friend then admits that he knew Jacob had a crush on my then girlfriend, but didn't know he was going to act on it. Mutual friend said that he was going to confront Jacob about it to see what else he could find out. And this is where Jacob's entitlement really takes off. Again, this was over 10 years ago, and we were young and immature, being 20-ish. But my mutual friend was nice enough to show me the conversation he had with Jacob over text message. So basically the gist of it is Jacob claimed that he knew my relationship with my girlfriend wouldn't last long term, and he came up with a great idea. His plan was that he would wait half a year to see where things would go, and then he would try to swoop in and convince my girlfriend to break up with me and let him have a turn with her. Needless to say, none of us were impressed with his idea, and he was pretty much ostracized by everyone for that little stunt he pulled. Yeah, forget getting ostracized. Like, if he keeps doing that, that's a quick way to be in a world of hurt. Like, the guy was lucky OP wasn't a confrontational guy. And really, I have no idea how Jacob thought that that was gonna work. And how the heck did that conversation go, right? Was he like, I know you're working and all, but you and your boyfriend have been dating long enough, and in my opinion, I don't see it going the mile. It's time you leave him and try me now. Yeah, that doesn't throw up any red flags at all. And guys, if you think that one was wild, listen to this next one where Karen tries the same thing. I'm a 28-year-old male, and my cousin Mary, 22 years old, grew up to be an extremely jealous person in her teens. We all hoped she'd grow out of it, but she hasn't, and she refuses to address it. When I proposed to my husband Sean a couple of years ago, Mary threw a fit. She wanted to be the first one to get married between the two of us because she deserved it, and she didn't even have a boyfriend at the time. Also, because Sean and I chose to have a small personal wedding, we were able to use the money set aside for us to buy a home and pay off half the mortgage. Cue another tantrum from Mary, despite the fact that there's money set aside for her too, including from our grandparents and Aunt Miranda, who chose not to have children. I think you can get the picture here. If I have something Mary doesn't, she wants it. If I accomplish something before her, it's not fair. There's no logic in her tantrums. So with that said, this brings us to Miranda's annual New Year's party. There's always food, drinks, and games, and it's a fun night where we can get drunk safely with family and friends if we want to, especially since there's no kids in the family at the moment. When I was returning from the bathroom, I saw Sean looking extremely uncomfortable and trying to fend off Mary, who was sitting much too close to him on the couch. I managed to hear her telling him that women are much better than men, and she was insisting that he try with her because, quote, he didn't know what he was missing and she could show him what he was missing. Now, Sean is 100% gay, so this was just pathetic for her. But I was seeing red over the fact that she was attempting to ruin my marriage to satisfy her jealousy. So I said, if women are so great, then go date a woman instead of trying to get my gay husband to sleep with you. The entire room heard this. I didn't control my volume. The party was ruined. Now, the family spared us from most of the chaos that followed, but we found out that the money that was set aside for her is no longer for her. And also, the tuition to pay the remaining classes for her bachelor's degree has been refunded to our grandparents, putting a halt to her studies. All the money from her parents is going to her younger brother, and all the money from our grandparents and Miranda is going to be distributed between him and myself. She's getting nothing. She's also been given 3 months to find a new place to live because her parents don't want her living under their roof. She basically ruined her life over this little stunt she pulled. She was given a massive leg up like I was, but she screwed herself out of it. I almost feel sorry for her. Almost. Okay, I don't. Again, guys, it's completely baffling how desperate some entitled people can be to the point where they resort to doing stuff like this. You don't know what you're missing. You haven't tried me. Like, that's gotta be the cringiest line ever, right? Like, get off your frickin' high horse, Karen. With that said, I'm glad the family didn't put up with her BS and decided against giving her money. Guys, don't you just love it when Karens ruin a good thing for themselves? Because I do. Okay, so this happened decades ago. My sister was 4 at the time, and I was 8 years old. My mom is an officer, which is important to the story. She was taking us to this big indoor playground for my sister's birthday. When we get there, Mom tells us to go off, have fun, and be safe. She finds a bench, and she starts reading a book she brought. Sister and myself were having a blast. We were climbing through rope tunnels, sliding down huge slides, and that's the calm before the storm. I remember a kid coming out of nowhere who's about 5 years old, who asked us to play with him. We loved making friends, and I readily suggested that we play hide and seek. The kid wanted to be it, so he starts counting, and we went to hide. It was pretty loud in there, so I couldn't hear when he was done counting. About 5 minutes pass, and I peek around, not seeing him anywhere. As my eyes were darting around, I finally spot him 15 feet away from me. And to my surprise, he was standing behind my sister, lifting her, arms around her stomach. Now, I was only 8 at the time, but I was old enough to know that he wasn't well enough acquainted with my sister to be doing something like that. So I run over and I tell him to put my sister down. And I stand in shock as he says, "No, she's my girlfriend and we're getting married." I then look at my sister, and she's obviously in distress. She's crying and trying to get away. So I do what I thought was best at the time, and I kick the boy in the shin, to which he responds by licking my sister's arm. And without hesitation, she lets out this ear-piercing scream, getting attention from our mom, the other adults, and the kids. We were pretty high up in the playground, but everyone could still see us clearly. Nearby staff, dealing with situations like this daily, quickly make their way up to us to defuse us. My only goal was to protect my sister, and the boy at this point is still squeezing her, and he's now biting her arm. I managed to wrestle him away from my sister, and I quickly guide her down a slide to the bottom to my mom, who was completely flabbergasted at what happened. The staff emerged from the playground with the boy, who is now crying and screaming for his mom. Enter the Karen. The boy was screaming bloody murder, and his mom comes, and she instantly starts yelling at me. She screams, "You are in trouble, you little crap. What did you do to my son? He was playing." I was scared, being yelled at by a stranger like this. And her son, through his tears, had the audacity to yell, "I wanted to marry her. She's my wife, and he won't let me, Mom. He kicked me." Karen then turns to my mom, and she says, "Tell your son to apologize for kicking my kid right now. He was just playing around." And my mother, being a cop, tried to find out what happened. She said in a very firm and calm tone, "Please stop yelling, we'll figure this out." At that, Karen stands in absolute horror at being ordered before she continues her rant. She then says, "My son was just playing, so apologize to him." The next thing she did was a huge mistake. In the woman's blind rage, she actually lunges forward and she grabs for me. My mother then raises her voice, saying, "Keep your hands off my son." Karen just ignores her, making attempts to grab me, screaming for me to apologize before turning to my mom, getting right in her face, and screaming at her to make me apologize. When my mom tried to talk to her while holding my crying sister, the woman pushes my mom hard, knocking her off her feet, and that's when the following happened. My mother then sets my sister aside and she stands up. She reaches into her back pocket and brings out her police badge. And I remember so clearly the look on that woman's face. Her eyes practically came out of their sockets. I think you can put together the rest. The cops were then called to the scene and the woman was charged, and she was obviously found guilty. My sister and I still talk and laugh about it to this day. It's always going to be a story we share for as long as we live. Guys, Karen's attacking off-duty cops and getting hauled off has gotta be the most satisfying thing ever. And when OP described the look on her face when OP's mom pulled out her badge, I'd say Karen most likely learned a valuable lesson that day: to never put her hands on a stranger. And seriously, I don't know why some people feel the need to physically discipline other people's kids themselves. That is never ever a good idea. It's just so funny how she was given multiple chances to talk calmly and sort out what happened, but no, she chooses jail that day. So when I was 22 years old, my extended family, aunts, uncles, and cousins began asking me why I wasn't married yet. I come from a very strict and conservative Indian family who saw that the only way a woman has any value in their eyes is if she's attached to a man. Her own accomplishments, talents, etc. are of no consequence. So it wasn't all that surprising when I began getting these ridiculous questions about marriage while I was still in college. I had recently lost a lot of weight, and for the first time, I actually looked good in jeans. And my weight loss seemed to cause their queries to reach whole new levels of idiocy. You see, they all assumed that the only reason I lost weight was so that I could land a husband. Surely I hadn't done it for the sake of my own health and well-being, or because I wanted to look good for myself. That would be preposterous. With that said, my aunt Karen was friends with a matchmaker. Now, matchmakers in India are these little C-word middle-aged women who have nothing better to do than go around carrying photographs and information about eligible bachelors and bachelorettes and share them with families of young men and women who are looking to marry them off. Now, my aunt's friend was no different. She showed my aunt a picture of some guy in his late 20s who also had a great job and was from a respectable family. Let's call this guy AJ. My aunt then shared the picture and information with my grandmother, and between the two of them, they decided that AJ, a person whom I've never met before, would be the perfect match for me. Keep in mind that neither I nor my dad had any inkling of what was going on. One afternoon, I think it was Sunday, my aunt comes over when I wasn't home. She then told my dad to get his daughter dressed up and pretty because she had promised me to a guy, saying that I would marry him, and his parents were coming over to see me that very evening. The tone in which she spoke made it sound like she had done me and my dad a big favor. My dad was shocked, and he asked what the hell she was talking about. She then told him that she had taken it upon herself to find a husband for me without my knowledge or consent, and she had taken some of the burden off his shoulders, and that my grandmother had approved of the match. My dad then told her that he would have to speak to me first, and whether the guy's parents can come over or not depends on what I have to say about this. Well, the little C-word Karen actually tried to convince my dad that my consent wasn't necessary, and that as elders, they had every right to make this decision for me. But my dad wasn't having it. When I came home a few hours later, my aunt greets me with a hug. This was enough to send red flags flying everywhere. I of course asked her what was going on, and that's when she gleefully told me what she had done. How her proposition had my grandmother's blessings, and it's been made final that I was to marry this man. I just told her to shove it up her rear end, and that I was in no mood to have an arranged marriage. Not then, not ever. At that, she looked shocked, and she asked how I could say such a thing after all the trouble she's been through to find me such a wonderful young man, and that I should be grateful. And that's when I decided to get dirty. I told her if the wonderful young man is so perfect, why doesn't she go marry him? My dad of course heard this, and he told me to watch my mouth. I told him if this bitch knew her place and knew not to poke her nose where it doesn't belong, this wouldn't have to happen. I wouldn't have to say such things. My grandmother heard the commotion from her room, and she calls out to my dad. She then begins telling him how she had seen the guy's picture, and the matchmaker told them all about his family, and how a match like this may not come along again. My dad told her that he would never force his daughter to marry if she doesn't want to, My stepmom said the same. I merely told her that she was insane and she belongs in a lunatic asylum. This, of course, caused both my grandmonster and crazy aunt to fake cry and go on about how they were family and family has the right to make decisions for each other. And I'm thinking, what the actual F? I wasn't going to budge, however, and I told them that I wasn't going to meet this guy or his parents, and my aunt better cancel the meeting if she knows what's good for her. My aunt left our house grumbling, but the drama was far from over. My grandmonster is one of the most entitled people that I've ever had the displeasure of knowing, and she decides to get dirty. In order to emotionally blackmail my dad to agreeing to the match and getting her way with or without my consent, she decides to stop eating. Anytime food was brought to her, she would break into crocodile tears and she would whine how my dad was dishonoring her wishes and how dare he disobey his own mother. As she was diabetic, her health begins to deteriorate and my dad was scared. One evening, he had my stepmom sit me down and asked if I would consider the proposal and just have a meeting with AJ's family. I was still adamant and I said no. My aunt then came over again and she said she had great news. As AJ's parents were still interested in meeting me, they would allow me to study and have a career after I married their son. I asked her what part of the word no did she not understand, and who the F do AJ's parents think they are to allow me to do anything? Hearing that, my aunt once again flies into a rage and she asked me how I could be so selfish, how I could disobey my own family like this and some other BS, how marriage is a union between families, not just individuals. She then gave me a lecture saying how in her days, girls were married off as soon as they reached adulthood, whether they liked it or not. So I was acting like a spoiled brat, trying to get what I want. I let her go on for some time as her hissy fit was quite amusing to me. After she exhausted herself, I told her that if she, grandmonster, or even my parents try to force me into this marriage, that I was going to end my life. That the cops would know that I did it because I was being forced to marry against my will, and all involved would be in a world of trouble. I also said that I would leave behind enough evidence in the form of emails to all of my friends and college professors detailing how I was being mentally tortured so I could be forced into this marriage. Both outcomes would result in all of them in deep legal crap. I even showed them the email that I'd written. All I had to do was send it. And if any of them think of locking me up or taking away my phone, laptop, etc., they should remember that my vocal cords still work, and I would gather the entire neighborhood with my screams, and the cops would surely be called. As I spoke, my aunt's eyes kept getting wider and wider. She was in shock, but she knew me well enough to know that I was very capable of doing this. She just left quietly. My grandmonster must have heard every single word because her hunger strike came to an end. My entitled aunt never tried to look for a match for me again. Later, my dad told me that he was only asking me to think about the match and that he would never force me to do something I didn't want to do. I told him I knew that, and I assured him that my threats were only meant to scare my aunt, and they worked. Thank frickin' goodness OP's dad was on her side. But how terrifying, right? Like, I couldn't imagine being in OP's shoes and dealing with that sort of family drama, especially when it gets that extreme. And I do get it. It's a culture thing and it happens all over the world. And I mean no disrespect when I say this. I've always felt uneasy about the forced arranged marriage thing. Like, be with the person you want to be with, right? It only makes sense. With that said, I do remember being in school, guys, and I asked a friend about arranged marriages in India because you know how kids are. And he explained how his mom and dad were in the same village in India and they were forced to marry each other against their will decades ago. The guy's parents are still together to this day, but I'll never forget what he said his mom said about the whole arranged marriage thing. She was like, and I quote in his words, "For the longest time, for many, many years, I never liked your dad, but I grew to love him." And that's what it's like with most women who are married off. But yeah, again, it sucks that OP was basically like over my dead body. And again, I'm glad she wasn't forced into a relationship that she had no interest in because that's no fun at all. Guys, let me know what you think. So being a retail manager for a retail drugstore chain, Friday nights are super busy. Everyone's excited for the weekend and alcohol sales are up. It starts off as a typical Friday night until a man who we'll call Ken walks in. Ken was making his way to the cooler to buy a 6-pack of Corona beer, glass. On his way there, he decides to hit on a woman and ask for her number, who we'll call Jane. That's when Jane's husband, who we'll call John, comes back, and he immediately confronts Ken and told Ken that Jane is his wife. Now, to get the full picture, Jane had a stroller with a baby in it. John is a large guy with tattoos for eyebrows and several extreme piercings. He looks like he'd be able to crush Ken on his worst day. I'm talking if he had the flu. That's how tiny Ken was compared to John. Both parties go their separate ways until checkout. Ken is in front of John and Jane and again tries to ask Jane for her number. This time, John, in a tougher, firmer voice, confronts Ken to leave his wife alone. After Ken pays for his beer, he then decides to wait outside, and again asks Jane for her number as they left. At this point, John's now furious, and he grabs Ken's beer and slams it against a concrete pillar outside the store. The glass breaks, and there's a huge puddle of beer. John then says to Ken, "Next time, that's your head. Leave my wife alone. I won't ask you again." He then leaves with Jane. And that was only the start of the crazy night with Ken. So Ken, being the entitled D-bag, comes back in, and he asks for a manager, and then proceeds to ask for a replacement case of beer. We told him that because we didn't break his beer, we cannot replace his beer. We then offered to call the police so he could report the assault and loss. Ken then tried to make a case that the store would get a lot of bad press with the police being on the news, so it would be cheaper and less stressful if we just give him another case of beer. We kept saying no multiple times, and then Ken throws a tantrum. The guy starts punching concrete poles, throwing whatever he could get his hands on, even toppling our trash cans. I called police not once, but twice. Unfortunately, it took police half an hour to get to the store, and Ken refused to leave without his beer. During that half hour, Ken's harassing the customers and throwing his tantrum, screaming that we did this. And if we wanted it all to stop, all we had to do was give him another case of beer. Luckily, the other manager who was on duty with me was large and burly, and he offered to escort customers to their cars. At one point, Ken even tries to grab the manager's leg like a little kid, begging for beer. When the police finally arrive, Ken's throwing his shoes and he picks up a piece of broken glass, looking like he's ready to charge. That's when police draw their guns and order his hands up and him on the ground. The police tell me that what they just witnessed was enough for them to arrest him, but they take my statement for good measure. Had Ken listened to John's first warning, he would be home alone enjoying some beer. Instead, he spent the night in jail alone with no beer. You know what they say, F around and you will find out. Like the first time, it was an accident. You see a girl standing by herself, ask for her phone number, she's got a boyfriend, sorry about that. You know, just move on with your life. Like the second and third time, no freaking excuse. And this goes back to the first story where the guy wanted to steal OP's girlfriend. This is exactly what could have happened. Like, did this idiot think that he would be able to continue harassing that girl with her boyfriend around without consequences? Yeah, all I can say is that guy's lucky that all that happened was his case of beer was on the ground and not him. But that, my friends, is r/entitled people. Guys, I hope you enjoyed today's stories. I hope you didn't shake your heads too hard. And if you missed the last episode on the channel, it's a wild one. A Karen tries to fire someone, only to find out that they're the store owner. It's such a funny story, so go check it out if you haven't. And myself and Stevie Boy will see you guys in the next one. We love you.